good day, everybody. It's the holiday season, which must mean for many, it's time to get ready to trim the tree or wax the skis. And oh yeah, we have to close the year for some of us who are calendar year ends. I know you're busy, especially those of you who are, again, calendar year end governments, or you have engagements with those governments. So I really thank you for taking the time with me today. As Amy mentioned, my name's Eric Berman. I'm a partner with Eide Bailey. There we go. Over the next approximately 2 hours, I'm going to help you plan out your winter, and other than planning those ski vacations and or maybe that nice Caribbean cruise, and we'll take a look into 2023 and beyond. So let's unwrap some early gifts and get to today's agenda. Today's session will focus on one last look on GASB 87 leases. You know, I was getting my files organized for 2023 for the writing that I do, and I noticed that I've been discussing leases in webinars and articles since 2014. And I'm saying to myself, by my watch, it's been a long, strange trip. So who knows? Maybe this is the last session on GASB 87, but you never know. I'm going to introduce you to GASB Statement Number 91, Conduit Debt Obligations, which for some governments may be a significant change. Again, it's just for some governments, not for all of them. There are some dangling pieces of GASB 92 and 99, which made it into some of this year's webinars, but it's always good to refill those stockings with care. And then we have another mongrel standard out there, GASB Statement Number 93, replacement of interbank offered rates, which again made it into a few of the webinars we did this year, but it keeps, coming back and fits and starts. We have two new standards since we spoke, I think, last. GASB Statement Number 100, Accounting Changes and Error Corrections, and GASB Statement Number 101, Compensated Absences. Now, yes, GASB has hit the century mark. Now, those are not implemented for this December year end, but you need to know what is going on. And then finally, I'll take a look into the ghost of Christmas future and see what's under the snow globe here over at the GASB. Perhaps it's an early gift for those of you who are close to planning out that inevitable day when you file your papers. This is what your heat map may look like, including a potential level of effort for many governments. This was published by GASB staff, so your government may differ. So it really depends on your government's operations. We all know GASB 87 is a big deal this year, no question. As I said, I've been talking about that since 2014. So obviously it is a big deal, but the rest of the gap for this year is not too tough to take so far. GASB Statement Number 91 could indeed be interesting. And notice that on both GASB 87 and 91, there are some tails, meaning that you may be clearing some points for a few years. And the reason why I say that it may last a few years, for those of us of a certain age, we may remember implementing infrastructure for GASB 34. And you may remember that it took 3 or 4 years for you to get straight in terms of infrastructure as well as other capital assets. So there are going to be some tails going on to get, to get things straight, because there's going to be contracts in the corner there that you say, hey, wait a second, I missed that. Okay. Looking into next year, the big deal is GASB 96 for many governments, and I'm already engaged with governments for consulting and advisory services on GASB 96. There are going to be some proposed implementation guide questions, as well as what the GASB proposed a few weeks ago on GASB 96. And those questions may clarify some decisions you may be making. Again, notice the tail beyond 2023. And again, to me, Statement 96 is probably the biggest deal. And then we're looking out a little further. And again, we have GASB 100, not too tough to take, as it's only applicable if there are changes and errors. But GASB 101, now that could be interesting, but it also really depends on your current compensated absences policies, procedures, laws, and regulations, contracts, and so on. Now, notice there are a bunch of projects in process. If the GASB's certain risk disclosures project carries forward, we're probably looking at 2024. Now, we also have a 10-question proposed implementation guide update, which was released just a few weeks ago. Not too tough to take for now, but if it sails through as usual, we're looking at periods beginning after June 15 of 2023 year end for you calendar year end governments. So June 30 governments, you're going to be implementing first. All the others are TBD. Now, there's one piece that I say breaking news at the bottom of the screen there, and hopefully you see it. It involves a potential update to GASB 96. In the current standard, the GASB only refers to IT software as part of the scoping of that standard. Well, unfortunately, that's not entirely what the board meant. And the original project that became GASB 96 was for so-called cloud computing. And in fact, that's what the project description many years ago discussed it as. It said cloud computing. But that's not what the result was. And it turns out that a significant amount of assets and related liabilities could be out there for space on cloud servers, such as, OneDrive or Amazon Web Services or similar, which may or may not be CIBIDAs. So stay tuned. Could there be a correcting standard coming? I might find out on Monday, because that's when the GASB is going to be discussing the updated technical plan. And once we see the technical plan, we'll know where that one is headed, and it could be a pretty fast track project. Again, one last look on leases, which maybe this is it, but maybe we'll do a lessons learned webinar next year as we all implement GASB 94 and 96. I'm trying to figure out that calendar for next year, but we'll keep you posted on our website. Now, remember that similar arrangements in your government may or may not be in scope under GASB 87. We're looking at all of your contracts. And again, notice I say the word contracts. That is vital. Many leases do not have the word lease in them. They don't have the word rent in them. And there's a paragraph in GASB 87 that states that leases include contracts that, although not explicitly identified as leases, meet the definition of a lease. And so you really got to look at all of your contracts, and you potentially may be looking at needles in a very large haystack. There are tons of potential documentation areas that may be connected to each contract, and pay close attention to things like purchase clauses, non-exclusive use clauses, and that's where the underlying asset is shared with some unrelated party. There's plenty of contracts that you may run into where there are payments for $1 or nearly $1, which may indicate a non-exchange transaction. And you may have clauses indicating components such as utilities, taxes, security, and so on. All of these need to be known as part of your implementation regimen in implementing GASB 87. Now, remember what a lease is under GASB 87. A lease is a contract that conveys control of the right to use a non-financial asset, also known as the underlying asset, for a period of time as specified in the contract in an exchange or an exchange-like transaction. Now, each of those phrases, as I explain often, is really important, especially exchange and exchange-like transaction. Now, breaking down those phrases a little further, what is a non-financial asset? It's almost as if you would know it when you see it, but guess what, folks? Non-financial assets are currently undefined in GAAP, but by the middle of next year, we're probably going to see an exposure draft on what is the definition of a non-financial asset. And if whatever is proposed from the GASB sails through, we may see a final standard by March of 2024. But again, you're talking at least 18 months from now, maybe, to implement something like that. In that non-financial assets project, they're going to clarify on how you present your capital assets, note disclosure, especially with those right to use assets. Right now, we can certainly provide you best practice, but what the board wants to do is put it into level A GAAP. Exchange and exchange-like transactions. So think about that for a second. So for example, if a government leases land for $1 a year and the value of that land is $100,000 per year, well, that's not an exchange or an exchange-like transaction, because the market rent may be much higher, which means that it's not really a lease. Now, similar arrangements in your government then may not be in scope for implementation under GASB 87. The most common examples of exchange and exchange-like transactions are, primarily program revenues such as licenses, permits, developer charges, grants, donations, and so on. Now, under the conceptual framework of GAAP, assets are resources with present service capacity that the government presently controls. Now, that's seemingly easy to understand until you get to leases, because, for example, there may be a build out that is going on, and you may not have occupancy of that space that you're leasing. So in that case, your term really doesn't start until you have that occupancy of that space that you're leasing. So you really just need to be really careful on documentation. For a contract to be short term at the day of contract signing, the contract really must have a maximum possible term of 12 months or less, including any options to extend. And it doesn't matter about their probability of being exercised. Now, by the way, those options become really important when we're going to talk about GASB 96. For a lease that is cancelable by either your government as a lessee or the lessor, such as a rolling month-to-month lease or a year-to-year lease, the maximum possible term is the non-cancelable period, including any notice periods. But be careful, your government may be used to fiscal funding clauses in contracts, and those are great for budgetary purposes, but they're not GAAP. For GAAP, they don't signify a lease, and they don't trigger a short-term lease. Let's not go down the road of, all of those transactions on the screen. Those are from the implementation guide. Don't go down those roads. None of those are going to be short-term. Now, I know you want to do the lease on the office space for 12 months with 49 annual renewals or the other two, but no, those are not short-term. So just be careful on the short-term piece. Now, how do we determine the lease term? Now, I have this book marked on my desktop because I have to refer to this, it seems, every day. If you've printed this out, just circle it. It really becomes important in determining how long is that lease term. So what we need to identify as part of our documentation is the non-cancelable period, and that's the period where neither party can cancel the contract. And then we ask ourselves about the potential options on the screen. And notice the operations that you do have a bunch of pluses that add on to the non-cancelable period, but that non-cancelable period, you need to know that before you pass go. Once you document all of those potential options that are there, sum all those periods up, and that is your lease term. And oh, by the way, you got to be at reasonably certain, which is more than probable. Okay, come on, there we go. All right. One of the most common conversations I have with governments nationwide is, what is the discount rate? And boy, has that conversation changed in the last year because of inflation. And looking at the market from this morning, who knows, it may change again. In the hundreds, if not thousands of contracts that we have looked at implementing GASB 87 for the last 3 years, I think I've only found one where a discount rate is stated. For vehicle leases, you have this thing called the money factor, but that is vehicle leasing industry jargon, and you still got to pull out your calculator to calculate the real discount rate, and you do that by taking the money factor and multiplying it by 2,300 and then dividing, and it's really jargon. We all know that we need principal, interest, and time to do a present value calculation. And so that interest factor becomes pretty important. Now, GASB requires the use of the incremental borrowing rate, which is the estimate of the interest rate that's going to be charged for borrowing, based on the lease payments during the lease term. But in most governments we've dealt with, that's not so easily done, as they're not often in the market issuing debt for the same term as a lease near the same time that the lease is signed. And in these cases, for lessees, there needs to be some form of policy to document the discount rate. And of course, you have to implement the policy. Now, could your government use the risk-free rate of return for US Treasuries, for example? Well, yeah, but that policy again needs to be documented and used, and for the period chosen aligning to your lease term. Now, once you've figured out the interest rate, use the effective interest method to amortize the payable, just like a mortgage. And payments are first allocated to interest and then the payable. And of course, those of you who are lessors, you do the exact same thing. You amortize you pay off the interest first and then the receivable. And so it really is a mirror. All right, whatever you choose, in terms of your policy, document it. Don't just do this in a vacuum. You're just going to, a lot of us are so used to, especially during the pandemic, just, staring into our screen and doing things. You do need to run this by a financial professional such as your treasurer. You may need assistance to determine the rates by talking to your treasurer or your CFO. Also remember that the rate must align at least to that non-cancelable term. And if you have no debt or no ratings, again, you can figure out some other proxy, such as, again, some form of risk-free rate of return, or the U.S. Treasury, state and local government securities. But you also have to remember that your government may not be risk-free. You're not as risk-free as the U.S. Treasury, that's for sure. So GASB 87 requires at the inception of the lease an intangible asset for lessees that would be recognized for the right to use the underlying leased property, plant, or equipment. But it may not be the same value as the liability, even at lease signing. And we're going to need to adjust the liability, for example, for any prepayments and any lessor incentives to arrive at the lease asset. But that's the debit side. So what about the credit? Well, we haven't calculated those numbers yet. The credit side is going to be a lease liability. I wouldn't use the word obligation because it really is a liability. And if you look at the text of GASB 87, it says the word liability. So, for those of us who are used to lease obligation, just X that out and put in the word liability. And that liability includes fixed payments, which are the most common, or they could include variable payments that depend on an index or a rate, for example, CPI, or variable payments that have minimums or maximums, and those could be fixed in substance. Now, this does not include payments that are dependent upon the usage or performance of the underlying assets, such as miles driven, hours used, or throughput, or copies made. Those are purely variable, and those are set aside. Calculating the liability is going to be just like calculating your home mortgage, and amortizing that liability is going to be just like your home mortgage as well. Now, if you happen to be on the lessor side, for lessors at the date of lease signing, that lease receivable is, again, the present value of the lease payments expected to be received during the lease term. And the receivable is adjusted for amounts of doubtful accounts. Now, the lease receivable includes those same factors, exactly just like lessees. Now, the caveat on that is any form of residual value guarantee payments that are fixed in substance. But by and large, it's a mirror image. Now, if there are variable payments based on usage, they're not included in the receivable and they can't be measured until it's incurred. And those are just inflows. For lessees, those are just outflows. Remeasurement also does occur. You have to be careful if it in remeasurements, you're going to remeasure a lease if one or more changes occur during the reporting year. And again, there has to be at least one or more, and the changes individually or in the aggregate are expected to significantly impact the amount of the lease liability or lease receivable since the previous measurement. So these factors are pretty much on the screen. The most common could be, is there a change in the lease term? But remember, you need at least one more factor. So you start at, is there a change in the lease term? But is there an assessment of all relevant factors that indicates that, okay, let's say you're going to have a residual value guarantee being paid as a lessor, or did your government change its mind on exercising a purchase option, meaning the likelihood from being, reasonably certain to not reasonably certain, or vice versa? Or was there a change in the estimated amounts for payments already included in the measurement of the liability, excluding changes based on an index or a rate, which I'm going to talk about in a little jiffy? Or is there a change in some form of interest rate, meaning you're going from, say, the incremental borrowing rate to LIBOR or something like that? And, was there a change of that magnitude? Or was there a contingency that was resolved? Now, GASB statement number 99, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, those adjusted these elements slightly. Now, governments will not have to remeasure the liability just for a change in the index or rate. And that's a bit of a relief from GASB, and it's important due to our inflationary period here. Now, something else again must go on, meaning not only the rate changes, but perhaps the lease term changes or something else goes on. So remember, remeasurement is also not going to be required just because your government's incremental borrowing rate changes, which would have impacted your discount rate. Again, something else must be going on. And I'm emphasizing that because we're getting to our next polling question.
All right, well, let's do this. Polling question will remain open, but we are sitting at 35% with option C and 34% with option A.
Well, guess what, folks? Government is not required to remeasure the lease until, in this case, the final year's minimum guarantee payment is known, because that minimum amount's going to change every year. And this is actually from 2021 Implementation Guide, question 4.14. The government is not required to remeasure the lease receivable in this case until the final year payment is known. And this is paragraph 49C. And what's going on here is we have a contingency that's going to be resolved related to payments received over the remainder of the lease term. And in this case, the payments are really variable and they become fixed in substance when the preceding year's sales are known. And I'm looking straight at the 2021 guide here. And therefore, the contingency in the lease is resolved only 1 year at a time, which is not the remainder of the lease term until the final year. And when the final year's minimum guarantee payment becomes known, then the remeasurement would be required. It's kind of a trick question, but it is common, especially in lessor type of leases, especially to retail places that are based on the prior year sales. So like the coffee shop, for example. And so it is a bit tricky, but it is common. The answer in this case is actually B. And so just be careful on this one. Okay, I'm going to close that down. All right. Come on. Here we go. All right. There are lots of ways that we could be at a related entity lease. Just think about all your component unit relationships, especially if you're a state. And I know there are a bunch of state folks on the line today. And I thank you for joining. I know you're busy. If the lessor is the component unit, then the debt and the assets of the lessor are the primary government's debt and assets. And the debt service is reported as the primary government's debt service activities. But there's a big except for here. If the blended component unit issues its own standalone financial statements, then GASB 87 does indeed apply. Okay, now if the lease is between two blended component units where there are eliminating entries, then the eliminations are done before the reporting is to the primary government. The due to, due from component units are also eliminated, and all cash transfers are just that, they're just transfers. Now, if there are leases between the discretely presented component unit and the primary government, or between discretely presented component units, then GASB 87 does indeed apply. Now, if there are receivables or payables to or from the component units, don't combine those receivables or payables with other leases because, again, you're dealing with apples and oranges in many situations. Now, due to these relationships, multiple answers occur in GASB 87. And again, if the lease is between a blended component unit and a primary government, doesn't matter if it's a lessee or a lessor, then the transaction is a due to, due from for general purpose external financial reporting purposes of your primary government. GASB 87 does not apply. And remember, these are not conduit debt, not certificates of participation or COPs, but they may be related to a COP. That said, understand the relationship and document your transaction for audit purposes. Now, remember, as I mentioned at the outset, governments routinely sign contracts that may or may not have the word rent or lease in them. These contracts, they just were not identified under the old lease guidance, which was in Statement 62, but that was really FASB guidance dating back to the 1970s. And as we kind of overlooked that stuff because these were obligations, they weren't liabilities. And if we failed to identify a lease under pre-87 guidance, we sort of messed up on the disclosure. However, we're now in a more important phase. And embedded leases can be found in many different types of contracts. And some of these areas that are most commonly identified, they are on the screen. And we're talking as a service contract, sales contracts, advertising contracts, transportation, construction, and related party contracts. Now, finding these sort of contracts could start by querying your records for recurring payments to the same counterparties at similar frequencies for similar but not exact amounts, because you could have leases that have ascending payments or variable payments. Now, you're going to be surprised at what is in your records and what is not in your records. And there are other places we found embedded leases, such as public colleges and universities, public healthcare, airports. They all have potentially embedded leases. Now, components are really common, especially for space leases. These are separable elements in each lease, including common area charges such as maintenance, utilities, security, parking. And in any lease, we'll need to separate those components and estimate their value. Many of those CAM charges can be figured out by reviewing similar contracts that involve that don't involve leases. I almost said that they do involve leases. They don't involve leases. And I almost got confused myself. So don't take this one lightly. In many cases, there could be multiple components involved in a lease. And think of the space that you're sitting in. It may involve some of the 5 elements that are there on the screen, including principal and interest. To determine the components, you need to separate out the principal and interest from the other components. And some of the components may have different terms. So, for example, in the space that I'm in right now as an office, parking was outsourced to a separate company that supplied free parking for the first 6 months of a year-long lease. Now, that's not too shabby, but utilities are billed separately, including power and internet. If I was a government, if Eric was a government, then those would be components because I'm paying the power company separately, water and sewer separately, the internet separately, and my parking separately. Those are all components, and I can pretty much figure out what those are based on my other contracts. Now, there are 4 steps to success in figuring out those components. Now, obviously, you got to identify them, and I just identified, 3 or 4 of them. Now, look for similar contracts if the contract is not identified in the lease. Now, the example I did, of parking, that's just that. However, if we don't know how much, we're paying for parking, or for utilities, or if it was completely variable, such as water, for example, professional judgment's okay, and it would be similar to setting of indirect costs. And if you're over or under, you can just adjust. But if that's still not practicable, then it becomes part of the lease. Now, I happen to know that, for example, my water bill and my electric bill here in Washington, D.C., they have minimums. And so I could figure out based on those minimums what my, annual charge would be. And then you just adjust on a go forward basis. Once the components are identified, separate payables for those charges need to be recorded unless it's not practicable to do so. Now, the goal would be to maximize the most observable information that is known. And again, the most common of these charges are CAMs, or common area maintenance. And that leads us to our next polling question.
All right, let's get your answer in. So far, we're sitting at 82% with option B.
Yeah, all right. This is good. This one is definitely B, and these are from the original implementation guide, question 4.61. And again, you may have different lease terms, which may impact the discount rates. And for those of you who are codified, it's code section L2723-4. Okay, good stuff, everybody, and thank you for chiming in on that one. I quickly mentioned the policy on discount rates, but there's going to be other policies that may need to be changed. I usually start here in the many implementations so far that I've been part of. It is one of the first questions I ask when we have our kickoff meeting. Okay, where are we at in terms of your policies and procedures? And I know some of you may say, well, we really don't have policies and procedures of which you're signing leases of which you don't have policies or procedures. So try to pull that stuff together pretty quickly. A lot of governments go right at the materiality box. Just really be careful on that one. Materiality is an audit construct and more than a preparer construct. And you got to consider the financial aspects of your leases. Here, I mean, if you're not going to record a lease in your LSC, what other liabilities aren't you going to record? Don't overlook operational aspects, including who's authorized to sign, extend, modify, terminate the lease, who sets the rates, who says it's okay to purchase, who says it's okay to terminate. All of those things are really important. And if you don't have those documented, your internal controls may be a little bit lacking. And so, try to document this stuff, and of course, make sure they're implemented. What about incentives in state laws? Some states have very strict regulations on what can be accepted by a public employee, and an incentive really is a gift. And so just be careful of what your gift laws say. An incentive may or may not be able to be accepted. What about components? Should we do some internal audit work to make sure that there are no unrecorded leases? All of these are going to be vital in implementing GASB 87, as well as GASB 96 and GASB 94, which I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes. And so just make sure all of these policies and procedures are really documented and you have them ready. Don't obviously jump to conclusions on software. I love that there's software out there, and we do work with a software vendor. If all you have is just a handful of simple contracts, maybe 5 or less or 10 or less, Excel can work for you if you know Excel. Now, you don't always need software, but if you work with Excel, remember you got to put internal controls on it, at the very least a password on that file, but make sure somebody else knows that password just in case, you decide to put in your papers one day and you don't want to leave your government in a lurch. But of course, ask yourself the questions in the screen. If you don't know the answers, yeah, you may need some form of software. Okay, that may be my last GASB 87 presentation. Here, just a round of applause from everybody. All right, GASB 91. Yeah, you never know. You never know. This could be an interesting one. All right, conduit debt. It's important for some governments out there because it may change the way many borrowers report debt. And GASB 91 really goes back to standards that are nearly 30 years old and replaces them. But in fact, even those standards are a lot older, as those standards, which were a part of a GASB interpretation, all that was a roll forward of existing standards that were issued 80 years ago. They were issued during World War II. That is really long in the tooth stuff. So what is conduit debt, or CDOs? CDOs require at least 3 parties: the issuer, the borrowers, which could be plural, of course, and a debt holder or debt trustee that manages the funds on behalf of the bondholders or borrowers. Now, typically, the trustee is a corporate trust department at an investment institution. So when I was an issuer back in the 1990s, we used, for example, State Street Bank, corporate trust. And State Street's not the be-all and end-all. There are plenty of banks who do this. A major change is that borrowers and issuers are not in the same reporting entity. And we find this often with finance authorities for governments issuing debt. The debt is often titled a CDO, but guess what? Those parties may be in the same reporting entity. Often the bonds are cross-collateralized or parity bonds. Now, that's a couple of jargon words there. Now, cross-collateralization occurs when one bond series collateralizes another. And if one bond defaults, the others fail in sort of a house of cards. And you kind of can picture that in your mind's eye. Now, what is a parity bond? A parity bond refers to 2 or more bond issues with equal rights of payment or equal seniority to one another. In other words, a parity bond is an issue bond with equal rights to a claim as other bonds already issued. In this case, one bond may be in default, but then the bondholders can sue all the other holders of the other bondholders for payment. So it's the same but different. And I know that's a laugh, but it is the same but different. In CDOs, the corporate trust department receives the funds and manages the funds on behalf of the borrowers and debt holders. So if all of that is in place, the issuer only has a limited commitment to repay the debt, as it's really the borrower's responsibility. So what does that mean? If you have a CDO in place, the issuer does not report the debt. The borrowers do. And that could be billions of dollars moving over from one general ledger to another. Now, this limited commitment is kind of difficult to understand. An issuer's commitments associated with a conduit debt obligation, they vary. An issuer's commitment with respect to, there could be a bunch of different ranges of commitments. So, for example, under an additional commitment, the issuer agrees to support debt service payments only in the event that, for example, the obligor is or will be unable to make payment. Examples of additional commitments by an issuer to support debt service payments include extending a moral obligation pledge or extending an appropriation pledge, which is what my government used to do, extending some form of financial guarantee, or some form of pledge of property, revenue, or other assets as security. Now, under a voluntary commitment, an issuer does not make an additional commitment as like that appropriation or some form of guarantee, but on a voluntary basis decides to step in and make a debt service payment or request an appropriation for a debt service payment if the third party is or cannot make payment. If they're unable to make payment or the third party cannot make payment. Now, GASB 91 focuses on form versus substance. Now, you may be familiar with the term certificates of participation or revenue pledges or limited obligation bonds. Those terms do not matter as much as the substance of the transaction. So if the bonds meet the definition of a CDO, then they are a CDO. And as such, guess what? If it is a CDO, again, the issuer does not report the bond issuance unless they have some form of non-exchange financial guarantee. And that is very different from today. And because typically, including the stuff that I issued back in the 1990s, the issuer reports. And that is important for some governments that are parties to CDOs that may meet the definitions but have never reported the debt. And so you're probably, you're that little emoji where the eyebrows raise up all quickly, and you're probably saying to yourself, "Uh-oh." So where's this all headed? Now, if a CDO is in place, again, if your government is an issuer, if that signs the bonds, then the CDO is not reported. Again, the obligors, the hospitals, colleges, municipalities, and so on, they report the debt. And as an issuer, your government may have a voluntary commitment, but again, that reporting is also limited. So be careful of all those labels and the jargon. Remember, the substance of the transaction is far more important than the form. Accounting and financial reporting depends on the facts and circumstances. CDOs should be financing capital assets, and in some cases, the asset reverts back to the issuer. And in some cases, the assets may be shared, and the accounting may be varied. And here are 3 scenarios you may want to review, and these come straight out of GASB 91 examples. So you may want to bookmark this or dog ear it if you printed it out, because you have to notice the differences in accounting. And again, the most common areas you see these are in dorms or in housing or in hospitals or, things like that, potentially parties to state revolving funds and so on. Some of these, some of these may be titled leases, for example, but they're not, and so you really have to be careful on these. Again, 3 times from the normal mind, if you have issued CDOs, do not report these as leases. Don't report these as liabilities nor receivable, again, if you're that issuer. If the arrangement does fit the definition of a service concession arrangement, it may fall under GASB 94. But again, we're talking about that for next year, and we'll get to that in a little bit. And that leads us to our next polling question. Okay, this one's also an implementation guide question. This is 2020-1, question 4.21. If at the end of the arrangement, the third party obligor exercises the option to purchase the asset, the issuer would not recognize the capital asset because guess what? They're not going to ultimately own it, but they would recognize an inflow of resources for the purchase price. The answer is B on this one. The answer is B. So good work, everybody. It was close, and there is a subtle difference between B and C, and it is straight out of the implementation guide. All right. Okay. Come on. Here we go. All right. What do you disclose? Like every GASB standard, you got some note disclosure. So you're only going to disclose in general terms what is going on and if there's a non-exchange financial guarantee in place. For bond issuers such as state revolving funds and infrastructure banks that no longer present debt information relating to CDOs, there's probably going to be an information exchange that you might need to undertake. And if you're one of those entities, you may want to start thinking about the internal controls over reporting and consider what is being done, for example, by statewide defined benefit pension plans and participants. And that could be a good regimen for an information exchange between entities and what's needed. Now, if there is a liability recognized at the issuer, then there are additional disclosures that are exactly the same as the disclosures required for non-exchange financial guarantees. Now, interestingly enough, the ASCPA Audit and Accounting Guide for State and Local Governments for 2022 doesn't mention additional procedures required for CDOs other than those required for debt and capital assets. But stay tuned. Maybe the 2023 guide may have some interesting changes. We'll see. All right. So we have some dangling pieces of Omnibus 2020, which was in the height of COVID, and Omnibus 2022. And what's the plural of omnibus? Omnibuy? Who knows? Or as the former GASB chairman Dave Out says, are we on the bus yet? And for omnibus, for December 31st, 22 year ends, only a handful of elements are left in the old 2020 omnibus, which was Statement 92. First, general governments may think they are solving a shortfall in contributions to a PERS plan in the same financial reporting entity by contributing capital assets, such as a building. But that might not work in many situations because the building is going to be contributed at carrying value. And as most of us know well, the carrying value in most government buildings, well, it's darn close to zero due to their age. And second, the building has to generate cash flow to pay benefits. So operationally for the PERS plan, it's not really a good solve. However, it is reported as a contribution for GAAP purposes, but if the carrying value is close to zero, guess what? Your contribution is going to be close to zero. And there are three other minor changes that are in GASB 92, including reference issues in the codification of governmental accounting and financial reporting. So it's really just a bunch of cleanup stuff that needed to occur within GASB 92. There are much larger changes in Statement 99 or Omnibus 2022. There are 5 areas of practice that were immediately implemented when GASB 99 was issued back in June. First, GASB 93 and LIBOR's sunset for taxable debt are being delayed by the ICE benchmark administration. And GASB 99 aligns those provisions because GAAP provisions were different than what banking was happening. Second, SNAP or the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program accounting, it no longer has a separate GASB codification section. The accounting and financial reporting is now going to be based on non-exchange transactions, which is, for those of you like me who are codified, that's GASB code section N50, N being for Nancy or non-exchange transactions, and for those of you who are not yet codified, it's the old GASB 33 as amended. The old term food stamps, it really is no longer used. The third piece is the mongrel dog of accounting, non-monetary transactions. And guess what, folks? You're now going to have additional required disclosure. And GASB will now require disclosure of how you measured the value of swapping out the old sheriff's SUV for the new sheriff's SUV. So, you know, you used to say, "Oh, I don't care. It's not a monetary transaction." And I got to tell you, not many governments report non-monetary transactions. Well, now you're going to have to disclose how you measured the value of the old car versus the new car, and said it netted out to zero. So you got to be careful on that one. The fourth piece is, and this is one that I was surprised that there needed to be new gap, but in a revenue pledge, if the primary government does not receive the revenue pledge of a blended component unit, it now becomes an interfund payable in a transfer. I thought that would be self-evident, but I guess not. So now it's on level A gap. And the fifth piece is a piece of GASB 99 reminds us that we do not need a total column in the government-wide statements. By adding a total column, it might be misleading. So it's not required. There are other little nits and gnats in gap where the GASB is playing whack-a-mole. So for example, the words balance sheet and fund equity, it still shows up in GASB statements where they shouldn't. And now the GASB is updating things. So the most important pieces of GASB 99 for most of us is probably going to be relating to the big three we're all dealing with right now, of which obviously you're probably dealing with two out of those three most often. Leases, public-private and public-public partnerships, and availability payment relationships. Try saying that one, the title of GASB 94. After New Year's Eve, or during New Year's Eve, public-private and public-public partnerships and availability payment relationships, or maybe after a couple of glasses of eggnog. And of course, subscription-based information technology arrangements, otherwise known as GASB 87, 94, and 96. Now, not all those changes impact all the standards, so we got to be careful. And further, the changes are for periods beginning after June 15 of 22. So for all of us calendar year ends out there, that is on January 1st. However, you may want to make the changes for GASB 87. Just be careful. You know, to clarify what is on the screen, earlier application is encouraged and is permitted by individual topic, to the extent that all the requirements associated with the individual topic are implemented simultaneously. Now, can you implement the piece on leases without the other pieces? Yes, but document how you did it. And as you may have heard earlier this year in other webinars, pieces of 94 and 96 may fall back to 87, depending on facts and circumstances. Now, there are 5 areas that are on the screen that relate to those standards: the term calculations, modifications of short-term contracts, recognition and measurement of assets and liabilities, and incentives. So what I've done over this and the next few slides is to include a blue box on what indicates to which standard. So just keep an eye out for those blue boxes there. And this one's in the upper right-hand corner. Now, first, there's a clarification on when a termination may occur. As you may know, an option to terminate is an unconditional right that exists within the contract. A provision that gives a lessee or lessor the right to terminate a lease only in certain circumstances or upon the occurrence of certain events, such as the action or inaction of the other party to the lease contract. Well, it's not considered an option to terminate the lease for the purpose of determining the term. For example, let's say the provisions that allow the termination of the lease due to a violation of the lease terms and conditions, and you know what we're talking about really is a default. Those are not considered options to terminate the lease. It's just a default. Now, parallel provisions of this are also in the PPP standard and in the CIVITA standard. But for CIVITAs, only the government's termination rights are included in GASB, as GASB 96 does not extend to vendors. And by the way, those termination rights for CIVITAs, those are going to be vital when you look at a question that is proposed in the pending exposure draft that we're in the comment period on. Similar options occur for contracts that are reasonably certain to convert to a purchase. And the lease term should exclude the period, if any, after the date at which the option is reasonably certain to be exercised. Now, this element is only for leases, as PPPs and CIVITAs. You're not going to be buying, a PPP or a CIVITA. Finally, there is a slight change in the term calculation if there is a purchase, or if there is a payment of all funds due, or if there is a default on the purchase. And again, it's only really slight. Okay, there's a great clarification on short-term contracts, and this is one I really was looking forward to because we see this a lot. And again, this only applies to leases and CIVITAs, as no counterparty in a PPP would ever sign a short-term contract, because it just does not make economic sense. Because if you're talking about a $40 billion, PPP for a turnpike, you're not going to sign a one-year deal. There's just no way. Periods for which parties in which a lease or a CIVITA have an option to terminate the contract without permission from the other party, or if both parties have to agree to extend, those are cancelable periods, and they should be excluded from the maximum possible term. In addition, a contract that previously had been determined to be short-term has been modified to extend the initial maximum possible term under the contract. It should be reassessed from the inception of the contract. And so again, let's say you determine a contract is short-term and you're just handling it, as an outflow, but you modified to extend the initial maximum possible term. It needs to be reassessed from the inception of the contract. And what this means is, if the reassessed maximum possible term is more than 12 months, well, then the contract is no longer considered a short-term lease. And that means that many month-to-month contracts may need to be reanalyzed. For a contract that's reclassified from a short-term contract, the term should be assessed beginning at the date of the modification for purposes of measuring the lease receivable or lease payable or CIVITA liability. So again, this could be a pretty big deal. So again, let's say you think something's going to be short-term, and then, midway or most of the way through the contract, you say, you know what, I'm going to modify and extend and so on. Well, guess what? From the date of modification, you need to remeasure either the receivable or the liability. So this could be a big deal. Now, these two changes that are on this screen, to me, again, these are pretty great clarifications. Now, the first applies to all three standard, while the second only really applies to PPPs. Variable contract payments that depend on an index or a rate, or those that are fixed in substance, they should be included in the measurement of the liability. All other payments, such as those based on the future performance of the lessee or the operator or subscriber or usage of the asset, they're not included in the liability. And I mentioned this in passing a little while ago when we were talking about leases and modifications, and as well as recognition and measurement. So again, you're not going to include those as part of the measurement of the either receivable or the liability, those variable payments. Further, the contract liability should not be remeasured solely for a change in an index or a rate used to determine variable payments, nor should the discount rate be reassessed solely for a change in yours or the operator's or subscribers' incremental borrowing rate. And this is going to really help out due to inflation. And again, you need something else going on. Now, for transferors involved in a PPP, a further element is added where receivable for the PPP should be remeasured if there's a change in the PPP term, and the change is expected to significantly impact the amount of the carrying value of the underlying asset as of the expected date of the transfer of ownership. But usually, those dates are decades into the future, and usually the carrying value might not change all that much, but it really depends on facts and circumstances. For PPP liabilities that are modified, the deferred outflow of resources recognized by your government as an operator, it should be adjusted by the same amount as any change resulting from the measurement of or the remeasurement of the liability for the underlying asset. But if that change reduces the deferred outflow resources to zero, then any further change, it goes on your resource flow statement. Okay, now for incentives, many of these elements in the screen were in the previous implementation guide questions. And what the GASB did was they moved all those questions up to level A GAAP. The one that I'm seeing often is the assumption of an existing lease by a new lessor or other reimbursement of costs. Now, those are indeed incentives. But just, bookmark these because they may be common. And all of these elements are already part of GASB 96. Now, putting things all together, this is a great cheat sheet of what is changing in GASB 99 relating to all three standards. So just keep this one handy. Looking at, next year, there are two additional areas and one subtle change in GASB 99 you may have missed. First, some of us know and love and can't live without GASB Code Section N30 or GASB 70 on non-exchange financial guarantees. These are when another government backstops debt just in case there are issues in repayment. Now, these are usually one-way transactions where there is not equal value for value. But there was a little phrase built into GASB 62 back in 2010 that talked about exchange and exchange-like financial guarantees. The GASB found that there was a handful of these going on. My opinion, when somebody's paying me in exchange for a guarantee on their debt, that kind of smells like a rat. It kind of sounds like a bribe. But GASB is now expanding the guidance for non-exchange financial guarantees to exchange and exchange-like guarantees in GASB 99. So if you got one of these going on, I'd have my spidey senses hat up. I'm just kind of skeptical about that, about those. Also in GASB 99, there's an expansion of derivative instrument guidance. And again, we're talking 1 year later. In this case, the derivative was supposed to be a hedge, but the hedge became ineffective, likely due to a movement of interest rates. Not like that's not going on. Given that the instrument is not for income or profit, indicating an investment derivative instrument, a third category of derivatives was needed. And reporting a note disclosure for these type of changes would be separate from hedging derivatives. Termination of the hedge did occur, and in that case, a gain or loss would be recognized. Now, when I was part of the task force that developed what became GASB 53, and we're talking 20 years, over 20 years ago. And I'm saying to myself, oh my God, that was over 20 years ago that GASB 53 came out. We didn't contemplate these transactions. I mean, Excel 97 just came out when we started working on GASB 53. Now that they did occur due to the Great Recession, and we didn't really think about them, But now in the current economy, GASB said, you know what, maybe we should update the gap on this one. But you will not have to implement this until December 31st of 24. Okay, there's a last piece of 99 that was from what became GASB 100's provisions that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. And so basically, they put it in 99 and then carried it forward to GASB 100. Now, there's no longer a requirement to change interim financial reports for these sort of changes. But that said, GASB and GAAP will now require disclosure in the notes to the financial statements of the nature of the restatement, including identification of the financial statement line items effective, but you don't need to do totals and subtotals. But you will need to still disclose the effects on beginning net position, fund balance, and fund net position as they are all applicable. So this will make its way into transition provisions from 99 forward. So those transition provisions become really important. And again, they're not for 98 and back, they're for 99 and forward. So take a look at what's in 99 if you do have a chance, or, obviously when we talk about 100 and 101 on a go forward basis, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, so onward now to 93. You may have forgotten about this one. One of the major problems that surfaced during the Great Recession was a price fixing fraud that was occurring between banks in London to set the rate that we know as LIBOR, the London Interbank Offered Rate. And after the fraud was discovered, the central banks of the world, including the Federal Reserve, got together to better regulate the setting of interest rates by all the big banks. Now, a major decision was to sunset LIBOR 5 years ago because, again, it was set fraudulently. However, that date was put on hold, and there are trillions of dollars of contracts that were in place when GASB 93 was issued, ranging from derivative instruments to leases to home mortgages that are adjusted based on LIBOR. So this is pretty important. And then we had COVID. So I've thrown some jargon at you. Like all GASB standards, there's some jargon. But to go through some of it just really quickly, LIBOR is the London Interbank Offered Rate, which is used for adjustable rate contracts, including mortgages, derivative instruments, leases, to name a few. My home mortgage adjusts by LIBOR plus a factor beginning on 2027. So far I haven't heard from my bank if they're going to change as of yet. And of course, my bank would love my mortgage to be refinanced because I hit the lowest point of interest rates to refinance my mortgage, and I refinanced with a variable rate as long as I could possibly get. And I am darn close to 2%, which is awesome, compared to what the rates are these days. Now, and it's pegged to LIBOR. LIBOR is a basket of 10 currencies with 15 separate maturities ranging from overnight to 1 day and all the way up to 1 year. And even with inflation, those rates are just far lower than the prime interest rate. Tokyo has their own IBOR, the EU has their own. Just in those rates, trillions of dollars of contracts are in stake here. And you know why this is important. Now, part of the agreement to sunset LIBOR was to allow central banks to establish their own highly regulated rates. And the Fed has their own rate, and they began publishing their own rate since 2018, and that rate is called a SOFR. And I said SOFR, not SOFA, by the way. However, a SOFA, as we all know, is used to hide our money, and especially in these days, due to the level of cash in circulation. GASB 93 removes acceptance of LIBOR as an acceptable swap rate for hedged taxable debt. But now, because of GASB 99, that date of sunset as set by the IBE is June 30 of 23. But even that date might move further because of global inflation and other factors, not the IB, the IBA. It's really up to the IBA as to what they do. And they meet monthly, and they may be moving that date further from what I read in Barron's and the Wall Street Journal. I mentioned at the outset that GASB hit the century line, and so here we are. Accounting changes and error corrections. I know for many of us preparers, yeah, it's one of our favorites. This one also changes middle-aged gap that existed prior to the GASB, and it was absorbed into GASB gap with GASB 62 way back way back before COVID. I think it's 9 BC, 9 years before COVID. That's 2010, and since then it's not been changed at all. And many of the provisions in current gap, they really stem from FASB 16, which was issued way back in 1971. I mean, for those of us who remember 1971, we were listening to Carole King and Three Dog Night. You know, that's way back when. And Jesus Christ Superstar, that was way long time ago when FASB 16 came out in 1971. There are three types of accounting changes that are still there, with one major change in red. And changes two are within the reporting entity. That's kind of interesting. And then the error correction provisions are clarified to what I think it may just result in better reporting. So let's go through the changes, including some potential myths that I'm going to end up busting for you. Now, changes in accounting principle, what those are changes from one gap standard to another gap standard that is preferable, but both are acceptable. Or it's when the GASB requires a change due to the issuance of a new standard. Now, to be preferable, you have to hit one of the provisions on the right. And again, there must be two existing elements of gap. And so, for example, let's say in your investment risk disclosure, you say, you know something, I think it's more preferable to go from the weighted average maturity for my investments disclosure to the segmented time distribution disclosure for my investments. Now, that may be more preferable for some way, shape, or form, but both are acceptable. What we're not talking about is going from well, let me start it this way. We're also talking about it for when GASB says, okay, we issued what we'll talk about in a few minutes, GASB Statement 101. And by the way, we need to change existing gap, okay, because we're going into a new standard. But I need to bust some myths. A change in accounting principle does not occur in any of these on the screen. So just keep these handy. The biggest ones that I see are the bottom, two there, where transaction was immaterial and now it's material. Let's say you didn't report infrastructure, but now you are. That's always been required. And so now you got to restate. And it's probably an error. Also, going from a non-gap transaction to a gap transaction. You know, I've reviewed some financial statements in my career that said, "Oh, we use FASB standards even though we're a government." Well, you can't be both, and you got to go one way or another. And you know, you got to apply GASB if you're a government. You can't have a mixture of both. And you may need to go from a non-gap transaction to a gap transaction, and that's a correction of an error. Okay, changes in accounting estimates. We know what these are. These are all through our basic financial statements, and they have assumptions and uncertainties. And changes occur with new data, new experience, and so on. And your most common accounting estimate may be related, say, to capital asset useful life, or maybe an investment valuation. But these are really common stuff. And if you know, for those of you who are just getting started on your financial reporting, because you're year-end financial reporting folks, or you're just finishing up your financial reporting because you're, June 30, folks, just take a gander through all of your basic financial statements in your note disclosure and circle where all the amounts and elements and notes that are estimated, that are derived from estimates, and you'll realize it's all through your financial statements. And so just be aware that these are going on. So here's the kicker. um, GASB added accounting changes disclosure to changes within the financial reporting entity. Now, before we all toss our badges, let's wait a second. What we're talking about here are changes in component units or adding a fund for continuing operations, not a new fund for new operations. When I put in, and I make comments directly to GASB staff about this, I say, well, wait a second. Funds are created all the time. Especially in the case of, we all received ARPA money. And let's say, since we received ARPA money, we had to create a new fund. Well, that happens all the time. So, that's a new operation. So GASB quickly inserted the phrase, not a new fund for new operations. What we're talking about is continuing operations, or we're changing from major to non-major or vice versa. And those changes are really important. But you don't include acquisitions, mergers, or transfers of operations that result in an addition or a removal of a discretely presenting component unit. Those will not be changes to or within the reporting entity. Now, you also don't include a component unit reported in accordance with majority equity interests as part of the category of changes, and that's GASB Statement number 90. There could be situations where a change in accounting principle may result in a change to or within our financial reporting entity. So for disclosure purposes, such as those changes in accounting principle, those would be a change to or within the financial reporting entity. So these changes could change some disclosure you may be long used to. Okay, now we got to get to the red box. We have our error corrections. You know what that is? You had a boo-boo. You had a brain cramp. Most of these are gap interpretation errors, math errors, and so on. I've done them. You've done them. We've all done them. We're in confessional. I can see the National Cathedral out my window here, up on the top of a hill on Wisconsin Avenue in Washington, D.C. It's time for confession. We've all made those errors and we've all done them. And so we do have GASB 100 walking us through the accounting on those. Now, due to all these differences, we do have different gap in GASB 100. Notice that changes in accounting principle and changes in accounting estimates are similar to where we are today. Changes in financial reporting entity are going to be requiring an adjustment of beginning balance as if it occurred at the beginning of the year. Remember, that includes major to non-major and vice versa, or creation of a new fund from existing operations. Finally, error corrections, that's the same as current GAAP. But in the immortal words of Steve Jobs, there's more. There will no longer be asterisking a row or a column and stating restated. You're going to need to include the restatement on the face of the financials. And so that's a pretty big change for the folks who actually put fingers to keys to prepare the financial statements. And that leads us to our next polling question.
So far, option A and option B are tied. And option D is leading the way.
All right, in deference of time, those of you who are saying D, it is correct. It's an estimation process. And so indeed, item number D would be correct. Thank you for chiming in. Okay, back to GASB 100. Okay, the note disclosure is going to change. Keep this screen handy as you implement changes and error corrections. Now, for changes in accounting principle and estimates, similar note disclosure is going to be required, but for principal changes where you're going from one existing GAAP provision to another, you're going to have to disclose why the new provision is preferable than the old one. And of course, since it's in note disclosure, it's going to be audited. So it better be a good reason why you want to do it. So another change I kind of like is the removal of the boilerplate language that I've done, that I know you've done. Again, we're in true confessional here. This boilerplate language is certain amounts were reclassified to current year's presentation. Okay, that's going to be gone when we implement GASB 100. You'll need to list the line items that changed and why the change is preferable. But again, let's bring Steve Jobs back again. There's still more. There are provisions to restate required supplementary information and supplementary information, or RSI and SI. This is, as a preparer and as a reviewer and as an auditor, this has been in the bone in my side for a few years, and maybe it's just me, but we do make errors in the MD&A and pension and OPEB schedules, budget comparisons, modified approach, claims development for risk pools, the introduction and statistical sections in ACFRs, or the combining and fund schedules. Okay, but what do you do with them if you make an error in the prior year's MD&A? Now we have GASB 100. Or what if you make an error in those 10-year schedules? Now we got GASB 100. For periods within the basic financial statements, meaning, let's say you had the current period and the prior period, and those are comparative financial statements. Okay, you're going to have to restate the RSI and the SI as it's applicable, including the MD&A. For periods outside the basic financial statements, no need to go back to the prior periods, including all those statistical section schedules and in ACFRs. The inconsistencies, though, in the RSI and the SI, you may need some note disclosure. And as we know in the RSI, we already have a provision for note disclosure that lists the changes from the prior year. For the MD&A, you can refer to the note disclosure explaining the change. But if there are error corrections, restate the periods impacted as long as it's practicable. So for example, I know of a utility that had a major error in calculating rates that went on for 10 years. All those 10-year schedules needed changing as they knew what periods were impacted. And if you cannot restate, the schedules will include notes as to explanations why you can't restate. So keep this one handy as to what's required and when. So here's what GASB's note disclosure may be. And again, if you're looking at this on your cell phone, I apologize for you, but if you look at the left-hand side, there's a change in a component unit presentation that is a part of the changes to or within the financial reporting entity. And an alternative is in the one here on the right-hand side. On the upper right. Correction of an error is text describing a correction of an error. And this one is pretty big. You're talking tens of millions of dollars. And this is, again, just a sample. And this is what it would look like. And you can refer, it sees as A, B, and C in the middle. And you can pull back here. I'll just go back really quick. Here's A, B, and C. And if you take a look at the column in your presentation, this is where it would show up. And notice it says, as previously reported, all of your changes going across, and then as restated. And hopefully that as restated amount, this all ties to your basic financial statements, of course. Okay. pretty easy peasy. And here is a different way of showing things instead of going essentially rows down and columns. Here is columns going across with your basic financial statements and then rows, so it's six of one, half dozen the other. Either way, I think they're pretty darn good. I don't as of yet have preference as to one way or another, but just be aware that there are two potential alternatives of showing these schedules. All right, that's GASB 100, and that leads us to GASB 101, compensated absences, or as somebody said during a webinar that I saw maybe last August. They said in front of a few GASB staff, maybe GASB should go back to GASB 101, and they were just joking, of course. But this is on compensated absences, and this was another standard that needed to be updated as it's nearly 30 years old. The conceptual framework for GAAP we use today is so much different. When the original standards were released way back in the early 1990s, we're talking right after the component unit stuff came out. I mean, gosh, that was GASB 14. That came out in 1992 or 1993. So we're talking way back, before cell phones, I think. So that's how long in the tooth this thing is. The conceptual framework for GAAP we use is so much different today. Benefit practices have changed. As we all know, our working conditions have changed. And we all know that current GAAP was very disjointed because you had two different acceptable calculation methods for the liability that led to inconsistencies. And then, of course, there's the note disclosure. And I know how you prepare your note disclosure. It's exactly the same way I prepared my note disclosure when I was a preparer for 16 years. I took my beginning balance, and that was my deduction, and my ending balance was my addition. That's not quite right. And I netted things as a preparer, and I'm sure you do as preparers. And guess what? The GASB knows as well that the note disclosure was really lacking in compensated absences. The basics of compensated absences are only really slightly updated. We're still considering leave for employees, not retirees. And a compensated absence would be when you receive cash when leave is used or when termination occurs. Compensated absences still may include non-cash conversion to OPEB, and that is something that is still very common. There are three phases to calculating the liability, and just like any other liability, other than in the year of conversion, we're going to need to start where we left off in the prior year, and we're going to add the current year services that have accumulated additions to that liability. And here's where the big change is. If the absence is more than 50% to be paid, which is more likely than not, then the liability would be recognized until it is paid. Now, that change in threshold is a big deal. We're going from probable, which is what we use under GASB 16, down to more likely than not. And that's going to cause a swing in your liability. Remember what more likely than not is. As some GASB folk describe it, it is 50% plus a feather. So it's 50.00001% to be paid. But there is a big exception, though, on this one. Leave that is irregular is not counted in the liability until it's more likely than not to have occurred. Now, this type of leave has skyrocketed since when GASB 16 was issued. We're talking parental leave, paternity leave, maternity leave, jury duty, disaster leave, and so on. Also, this thing called unlimited leave has also risen, especially during the pandemic. Until that leave has occurred, it's excluded from the liability. Now, for large governments, the measurement of the liability is going to be difficult, but it always has been. It still will involve a three-step process of measurement, multiplication, and adjustment. Due to the lowering of the probability threshold from probable to more likely than not, unless a non cash settlement occurs, that liability is going to change. Once the hours are known, the dollars must use the current pay rate unless it is known that the settlement will occur at a different rate. And this different rate is usually in a collective bargaining agreement or something similar. The adjustments include those payments that are either directly or incrementally related. And the payments may include things like Social Security, Medicare, defined contribution payments that are based on hours earned. All of these are summed up to develop the liability. But guess what? Other than the threshold, not much different than today. Now, one big change from GASB 16 is some governments are using shared leave pools, especially for catastrophic illnesses. If the leave is not attributable to a specific employee as of the financial statement date, then the liability measurement uses the rate that is representative of all employees. Now, the board did not stipulate an average, but one can imagine an average or a median, and then you disclose that process as part of your summary of significant accounting policies. For liabilities that are settled through non-cash means, just use the amount that's more likely than not to be settled as the amount is being recognized. Okay, so the note disclosure. This is actually a little bit easier once you implement GASB 101. Now, the beginning and ending balances, they're still there, but now you got a choice. You can still do increases or decreases or present a net amount as long as it is noted that it is net. Gone is the disclosure of which government fund is going to pay for that liability, because that was pretty much nonsense, and it was pre-GASB 34 gap. It was boilerplate. We said, yeah, the general funds are going to pay for it. Well, duh. Of course, the general fund is going to pay for it. But the note disclosure was pretty long in the tooth, and people were pleading with the GASB to drop something in note disclosure, and that was one piece that they did drop. So it did hit the cutting room floor. That gets us to the end of GASB 101, and maybe we'll see GASB 102 into the future, because I need to go pull out the GASB snow globe. It hasn't snowed here in Washington, D.C. as of yet. It did snow up in New England where I also live, but it hasn't snowed here as of yet. But I'm going to look into the crystal ball and see what's going on here. So the exposure draft on certain risk disclosures is nearly focused. Now, the GASB could have gone down the rabbit hole and proposed to have governments disclose all significant operational and financial risks. But that's not where the proposal is. That word certain is vital. And the GASB uses the word certain a lot, and that means narrow focus. The focus is on concentrations and constraints that are specific to your government. So don't look at your neighbor. You got to be specific to your government. Now, the exposure draft contains a definition of a concentration as a lack of sufficient diversity related to an aspect of a significant revenue source or expense. It also contains a definition of constraint as a limitation imposed by the government by an external party or by a formal action of the government's highest level of decision-making authority. Now, that definition sounds familiar, doesn't it? Kind of sounds like a restriction. Concentrations and constraints may limit your government's ability to acquire resources or control spending. And a combination of concentrations and constraints may make your government vulnerable. And the GASB's examples are on this screen, and you kind of know what they are just by your normal operations. Now, if approved, and that's a big if, governments would be required to assess whether an event associated with a concentration or constraint has occurred or is more likely than not, there's that phrase again, to begin to occur within 12 months of the financial statement date or shortly thereafter. For example, 3 months after, meaning up to 15 months past your financial statement date. So you can imagine that you're going to be doing this pretty late in the process of your financial reporting period, meaning that you're almost done. You're probably getting ready to sign the representation letter. And then, oh, by the way, you got to figure this out if you have a concentration or constraint. By the way, you got to be like your local weather person and look 12 months in advance and plus another 3 months. Governments would also have to assess whether it would be at least reasonably possible, meaning less than more likely than not, that within 3 years of the financial statement date, the event could cause or would cause there to be a substantial impact on your government's ability to provide services at the level provided in the current reporting period or meet their obligations as they come due. Now, if your government determines that those requirements for disclosure have been met for concentration or constraint, well, there would be disclosed information in the notes of the financial statements. And that disclosure would include the concentration or constraint and each event associated with the concentration or constraint, that including the event either has occurred or is more likely than not to begin to occur within 12 months of the financial statement date or shortly thereafter. It is at least reasonably possible that within 3 years of the financial statement date, the event will cause there to be a substantial impact on your government's ability to continue to provide services at the level provided in the current reporting period, or meet your government's obligations as they come due. You're also going to have to disclose actions taken by your government prior to the issuance of the financial statements to mitigate that impact. Now, all of this is controversial, as there is an alternative view. As the project gets closer to reality or not, we may need to do more on this, during 2023, but this seems to be sailing in choppy waters a little bit. Will it get approved? I think, but might be a lot of change from where it is as of right now. And so there are some headwinds against this one. I did mention that the GASB has a new implementation guide update exposure draft. There are 5 new questions on leases proposed and an amendment to an existing question, which is mainly, just a little bit of a text edit to clarify. The key questions on my mind are on GASB 96, and comments are due next month. And if approved, as IGU exposure drafts usually are, implementation would be for fiscal years beginning after June 15 of next year, except for the one question on GASB 100, which would be delayed until GASB 100 is implemented in the following year. Now, there's a couple of questions I want to talk to you about. And this first one, which is question 4.7, and again, this is just proposed. Don't go to the bank on this one. Hold on this one, but this is a biggie. Now, many of you may recognize the language on the left, especially this time of year, because you may have just made your annual payment for your antivirus software or your Office product, or you name it. Take a look at that question and then look at the proposed answer on the right. So that question took me and a couple other people at the GASB, about an hour and a half to write, just to get it right, because we couldn't use the name of a vendor that begins with M, or we couldn't use the phrase office dot you know what it is, and we couldn't use a software manufacturer with an A, or you name it. So look at the proposed answer on the right. Now, if such a contract is an option to terminate and it's not a purchase, because a purchase is going to be a permanent right, then what is it? So what we do is we crack open our copies of GASB 96 and I look at paragraph 13, and that's what I got put on our screen. And look at paragraph 13, and look, I can see your eyebrows being raised. So this is, if this is approved as it is drafted, it could be that some or many contracts your governments have really are short term. But for audit and certainly internal control purposes, including anti-software piracy laws, you got to still inventory them. Again, don't automatically exclude all of your CBITAs other than ERP systems, but see this language and see the alternative. Now, again, there is a further issue in GASB 96. Like leases, as governments have started to implement 96, I mentioned that there's a glaring hole in the standard relating to cloud storage. Cloud computing arrangements was the original title of the project that became GASB 96. And in scope was contracts relating to storage apps such as, so you know what they are. They begin with I or A or, so on. But 96's final language did not include the language as being in scope. And it was a little bit of a boo-boo in GASB's part. Terminology in 96 may need to be amended through another one of those omnibuses, but we're not going to know about it until maybe a week from Monday, or a week from today, excuse me. May know about it, but let's wait and see what due process brings. Okay, now, today, we don't have time on the financial reporting model. We're getting close to the top of the hour. Let's just wait until next year on this. We also don't have time on GASB's other projects, going concern and severe financial stress, and then classification of non-financial assets. I'm going to talk to you in 2023 on those.